I'm going to give you just a really brief introduction to why partnership, what that means for us, and then we'll go into the next page as well. We have one of our partners who's also just joined us online, so he'll be speaking to us just after I've finished, and I won't keep you very long. But really, what I wanted to do was talk to you a little bit about why we bother with partnerships at all. And these slides might look familiar to the cohort ones. They're very similar to last time. And I hope that none of them have told me they had a dreadful time doing the webinar with the partners. Instead, it was really quite low. So don't worry too much about it. One of the things that we want from our Centre for Doctoral Training is to be able to really get the benefits of AI out into society. And in order to do that, we need to think about whether we can adopt things soon enough. So are they safe enough, and can we therefore demonstrate it? Can we accept them? Or is it a question of really regulating and preventing the adoption of something that really is unsafe and shouldn't be allowed out? And that shouldn't is also one of those really interesting questions. Who says? And as we do that, we really don't want to do that in isolation. Partly that's within our cohorts, so having a mixed group, but it's also partly thinking about what's outside our walls here. Today we've got sunshine, yesterday we had rain. Beyond these walls and beyond this campus, there's a much wider world outside, and we can't work in isolation. So the partnerships that we've got as part of this Centre for Doctoral Training were quite distinctive. I don't think we quite knew how distinctive they were until we went and spoke to the funding agency when we were interviewing them. And they asked us lots of questions about the partnerships, and it seemed to be quite something that was really different to some of the other centres for doctoral training. And partly that's how we want to use these partnerships. The other part of this is in terms of developing your own skills and talking to people who are not experts in your discipline, but have some understanding, is one of those skills that is absolutely invaluable, and you will have at the end of your PhD if you don't already have it now. By bringing in our partners, we sort of help you to hone that skill. You'll find that the partners are particularly interested in work, but they don't all have the same academic background. They don't all necessarily have the same research depth. And if they did, then they probably wouldn't be partnering with us because they've already had the skills. And as Ibrahim just mentioned earlier, they might well be your future employers. We know that about 80 or 90% of PhD graduates in these kinds of areas go out and work in other organisations other than academia. We're quite comfortable with that. Obviously, we'd like to show you how marvellous it is to work here, but we won't convince all of you, and that's okay. So they've told us that they would like to employ PhD graduates with the skills that you'll have by the end of PhD. So we'd like to be able to help them with that. So from the other side, it's not just about employment. Why do our partners want to work with us rather than working on single PhD projects, for example? So for Saints, they care about safety. And that's something that we were really careful to speak to our partners about when we were developing the proposal. We don't need as many partners as we have. Instead, what we want to have the deep partnerships with organisations that actually understand the point of AI safety or understand that AI safety is going to become increasingly important. And so that's really key to us. They helped us to shape that CDT in different ways. So some of them were much more involved with this as a group beforehand. But they've helped us to figure out what it is that we need to give you in terms of skills, and also what they want at the end of it. We think at some point in the future, we'll probably also be offering some of the courses that you're taking as continuing professional development for our industrial partners too. It's something that they're keen on, but it's something that we're not quite ready to do just yet, partly also because what we want to do is just make sure that it's just right. And so our first year cohort have really helped us to give some feedback, to make some tweaks to our courses as we've gone along. We'll hope you'll do the same for us as well, and we'll just continue to improve that as we go along. Not that it was bad the first time, just that we'd like to make sure that it continues to get better. Some of our partners have also offered a little bit more. So some of them have offered access to data, access to labs. Some of them have already committed to hosting secondments, which you don't need to worry about just yet. That'll be coming towards the end of the second year or beginning of the third. And on top of that, some of them are also offering some co-supervision, or rather some advisor capability as part of the PhD. And that's something we'll be doing as part of our ongoing process to allocate projects, then also figure out what the team is in terms of whether there are additional skills that would be beneficial to your project. So the only unusual partnership within, well, they're all different, but the only really one which is vastly different to the other partnerships is one from Erwin Jacobs. So Erwin is a philanthropist who's based in San Diego in the US. And he has built up a huge fortune and a technological empire. And his interests really are in supporting the next generation of engineers in particular. But actually, when we went to talk to him about safe AI, he was really interested in some of the interfaces between the disciplines and understood that figuring out the technical basis for safety was just one facet of safe AI. So he and his wife supported us with £2 million of cash, which pays for some of the studentships. And we decided that actually the best way for us to do that was to support the whole cohorts rather than identifying individuals who are supported. So that means that you're all supported by the gift, and it means that that's really helping us to figure out what it is that we do as a cohort. But it shows you the importance of what you're doing, that somebody is willing to give a £2 million gift into a centre for doctoral training. And just for context, the government in the UK gave us £8 million. So that kind of gives you an idea of the significance of that gift to the Centre for Doctoral Training. We've got some colleagues from OPPA, that's the Office for Philanthropic Partnerships and Alumni, who'll be coming here tomorrow, and they'll be telling you a bit more about that gift, a bit more about the context of how that sits and some of the other interests of the family. But also they'll be taking your pictures, they'll be starting to get some short snippets of information from you, because what we'll be doing is giving him and his family some information about the kinds of things that you're working on, the kind of individuals we've brought into the cohort. And he's really interested. So Sumaya and Dawood from the first cohort came with me and a couple of colleagues to London in a couple of months ago, July, earlier this summer. And we met Erwin and his son for dinner. It was a delightful evening. Sumaya can give you more details about how nice that dinner was. But really right in the middle of central London. And sometimes we get the opportunity to do that with some of our partners. I can't promise it every year or every week, although if you find opportunities, I will definitely go in for them. So Ibrahim's shown me this slide of partners before, and it's slightly overwhelming. So we've got 36 names on there. But really, I thought I'd pick out a couple and just tell you what they are. So we've got organisations like OXA. OXA is a company that's particularly involved in developing a software for driverless vehicles, and they've been just successful in launching a funding round over the last few months, well, millions and millions of pounds. So they're an organisation who care and understand about AI safety, but they really want to embed that into vehicles. So that's their particular focus. The Fraunhofer Institutes, which are based in Germany, and Valentina, you might know about some of these. So they are much more interested in research partnerships rather than necessarily in terms of those industrial applications. So Fraunhofer Institutes are those which work on industry research and with government funding as well. But they are particularly interested in looking at academic exchanges. So they'd be happy to host some of you over there at some point. Organisations like the Office for Product Safety and Standards, so they're a government regulator, and they've realised that although they started thinking that AI was not really within their remit, as soon as it becomes incorporated into products which are there for sale, it suddenly changes everything. And so they've realised that they do need to care about the implications of having AI in products. We've got organisations like Cambridge Consultants. So Cambridge Consultants do all sorts of consultancy on all sorts of different topics. They're not just interested in those embedded AI systems, but they know also that they have a huge team, hundreds of people, but their AI safety area is very small. So they're looking really on that partnership in terms of upskilling their own team, but then bringing some of the graduates into their own team as well. So each one of these organisations has a really different motivation for partnering with us. And the other thing to say is you may or may not get much input from them for a while. And that's nothing to worry about. We'll just figure that out as we go along. I think we've been reasonably relaxed about bringing people in as and when there's a reason for doing it rather than forcing those relationships. So today we're getting you all to say a few words about yourselves, and this is really our chance for us to enthuse our partners. This worked really well last year. We had some amazing feedback, and people came back and said, we're really interested to to see people, face to face. We're really interested to understand a bit more about their backgrounds. How on earth did you get such interesting people in the first cohort? So I'd really like that feedback again from this time, please. Precious. We've given you some optional prompts on the kinds of things that might be useful. We're not expecting anybody to say do the same thing in exactly the same order. If we wanted that, we'd have been a lot more regimented. We wouldn't have recruited interesting and diverse people, and that's really not what we're going for. But we haven't asked for any questions and answers. We figured that was a little bit too early for you, and we don't want to scare you off. I think that's everything from me, which then allows me to introduce one of our partners. So on the line at the moment, we've got Joost Noppen. Joost is Chief Researcher in Software Engineering and leads a team at BT. He's had a career that spans academia and industry, and he also has a PhD himself from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. Joost is really enthusiastic about connections between researchers, and he and BT are partners to the same CDT. Joost, I hope that you're now on the line, and thank you very much for joining us. I think I'll just hand over to you, if I may.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me as well. Yeah, so I can only echo what I've just heard of the new PhDs and new thought leaders being needed all across the board. And I sit in the research department in BT, and we're desperate for talent. The AI landing in this space is amazing and at the same time terrifying, because we don't really know where to go and what is happening. And the more skill and talent there is, the better. So there's a good future ahead for you in industry as well as academia. So don't feel limited to academia. I've seen both sides. It's good on both sides. So let's start with that. What I wanted to talk to you about today is a bit about the BT experience in AI and how that has led to our interest in participating in this particular CDT. Safety of AI comes up in many different ways, in many different shapes. And there's a lot of opportunity, but there's also a lot of unknowns. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about the software development aspect and how AI plays to that. I know not all of you necessarily focus on this, but it is likely a good framing device, because it is the area where I would say AI has had the biggest impact, and intuitively that makes sense. Because a lot of activities in the software space are particularly well suited to what AI can help with, right? You have large language machines who can help with code prediction, for example. That makes sense, because coding tends to be quite predictable. For every bracket open, there needs to be a bracket closed somewhere. And there's a lot of training data out there in GitHub and all that kind of stuff. So it makes sense that early on the biggest impact would be in this space, in particular in the coding space. And then it started to balloon from there, and this led to all kinds of questions and interesting angles. So let's have a look at that. BT's AI journey, and I'm just going to talk from the BT point of view here a little bit. It started exactly 2 years ago, about 2.5 years ago, technically, when we first started looking into this kind of stuff. And then 2 years ago is when we onboarded our first generative AI tool into the company. And since then, it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride in a good way. But at that point in time, say 2 years ago, we'd like to think we had a reasonably modern way of developing, right? We developed all kinds of web apps and mobile apps and all that kind of stuff. And we had all the usual governance you would expect. We had our version management, and we had our coding environment and our integration between our delivery teams, all that kind of stuff. And our developers could do their job and they could get on with it. And it would be deployed typically in either our own cloud, which is Enterprise Cloud or EC, or it would be somewhere in the public cloud. And then you would have your solutions all in place. And this had been trundling along for quite a few years. And then AI came in, and this was the kind of stuff you would see early on, where you would have people say, okay, generative AI has arrived and everything will change, right? It can do architecture design, and it can write your tests, and it can deploy your software and all that kind of stuff. And you can imagine at that point in time, a big company like BT looks at that and says, okay, this sounds great, but how are we going to deal with this particular thing? Because there's going to be a lot of impact beyond what we initially could imagine. If multiple roles get affected at the same time, how do you build a company around that? And most importantly, how do we keep everyone and everything safe? BT is a fairly heavily regulated company in the telecom space for a number of reasons. Obviously, we're subject to Ofcom as our market regulator. As every other company, we are completely subject to GDPR constraints, but you have to keep our customer data safe. It's a really good thing that we keep that safe. We don't want to lose that. But we also have other constraints, such as our relationship to Openreach. Right? Openreach is the main infrastructure builder of BT, and there is a historical connection, but we are regulated in how we can engage as a telecoms provider, a service provider over the top. And what you don't want is to put AI inside of that environment, and all of a sudden things start going wrong in that space, because any breach of that already is a company killer, and that is beyond what it means for the individual. So very interesting times that we had coming. And we started to dip our toe in the water really with coding assistants 2 years ago. So your traditional coding assistant effectively sits in your development environment, like the one that you see on screen here, and you have a chat window here, and when you type, it gives you autocomplete suggestions and things like that. And these were kind of the first commercial products that you could buy off the shelf, and they were really interesting because they would help with stuff that our developers really wanted to have help with, right? Code completion, in particular for boring and repetitive stuff. Was very welcome. Right? You want your developers to work on the hard bits and not on the stuff that doesn't really challenge them or needs a lot of thought. Then you get to the natural language chat, a different way of interacting. Rather than programming it, you instruct an AI to do it. That also was very appealing. And you could select stuff and say, can you explain this code to me, because I don't know what it does. And that is quite important in a company, because typically you don't start your software from scratch, but you add to software that already exists. And in order to do that, you have to understand what is there. So all those things really made good sense. And then people learned a bit about prompting, right? You give it an instruction to do something specific, not exactly right. You have to refine your prompt. So all those kind of things started to play out. And quite rapidly, we started to run into the limitations of this kind of technology as well. So writing some code is fine, but saying, can you make this whole thing faster? That actually is a lot harder, because it requires more substantive understanding that generative AI at that point didn't have. And right now also, I don't think completely has. What is interesting, and I think this is the first nice link out to safety, is one of the main things that these LLMs could do quite well is look for very common mistakes, right? Effectively, they're pattern matchers in some way, shape, or form. So they know that if a particular pattern that is problematic is being used, it can highlight that and say, what you're doing there actually is not industry best practice, or it's an outdated way of working. So there is this promise that just having an AI sitting on your shoulder could improve the quality of your code and thereby reduce the safety concerns you might have. So thereby AI will be a contributor to improving safety. And there's always a promise of more coming, right? Everything works well. So we rolled this out. So what actually happened in that case? And I think there's a number of interesting things that we can highlight here. The blue line you can see on this stylized graph are the activated licenses. So how many people are actually using this? Now it's good to know for context that BT roughly employs 5,000 to 6,000 people we would classify as developers in some way, shape, or form. And we rolled this out in specific business units up first, because of course we wanted to know whether it works before we spent a whole lot of money. And when we rolled this out, initially there was a bit of a bump to about 1,100, and then you saw a bit of fall off, and that was interesting, because that's where you get literally into the trough of disillusionment, where people looked at it and said, okay, the promise of code completion is there, and the promise of natural language prompting is there. But actually, in practice, at that early time, people found that the tool gave quite a few wrong suggestions, or that you have to prompt it quite a few times to get you to the right state. And they found that actually got in the way, and people then started to leave it a bit. And it took us a bit of time to work out what was going on. And initially, we thought, you know what, maybe the tool is not that good. But it was also possible that people weren't yet used to how best to use this kind of technology, that they were trying to do their job the same way, even though the tool gives them more opportunities if they change their way of working a bit. So what we started in roughly a year ago is an adoption drive where we had vendors come in and train people up on the specifics on how do I get the most out of this tool. And that's where we saw this adoption skyrocket, because people then realized, oh, actually, this is helpful. And this was further accelerated by new capabilities landing. And this also is a good indicator of how fast this market is growing in terms of the capabilities that can get offered. And this went through the roof. And I think we're currently at roughly 3,000 people who have it out of the total of 5,000. And those remaining 2,000 typically work in technology stacks that just aren't very well supported, right? In the telecommunications industry, you have some very specific languages, for example, that just will not make it into an LLM. So there are no tools to help them just yet. And that's always will happen in some way, shape, or form. But BT's journey has been very much rolled it out, initial hiccups that you always have, and then people caught on to it and people were happy with it. So perhaps a better way of seeing QDeveloper is our tool, by the way. I have that on there as I've seen that term so much for me, it's equivalent to a coding assistant, but QDeveloper is the tool that we use. What you can see here is that effectively a similar pattern was followed. Initially, people started using it, and then it stabilized for a bit. And until the adoption drive, people didn't really know how to get the most out of it. And after new capabilities landed and we trained people up, we could see the number of lines of code written by QDeveloper absolutely go through the roof at this point in time. And that is an indication. I'm not going to say it's an indication that AI is beneficial per se. There's a lot of nuance to the particular discussion. But what it highlights is that the tool itself is influencing the business in some way, shape, or form. And then you can start teasing that out a little bit more. So the question we always got early on is, okay, how much productivity benefit do we get out? And I think this is perhaps a bit of a unique a safety of AI rollout angle, because that question for the people in a company can be dangerous, right? If you take the wrong metric, like lines of code, and you see that go up, it's very tempting at a management level to think, you know what, more lines of code, this must be working. We are now producing 20% more lines of code. I can do with 20% less people. And it is a very easy step to take, but it's a very dangerous thing to do. So one of the big research angles that we've had over the last 2 years is what can we measure versus what can we conclude from that? And this is a great example. This thing here, this number took on its own life in BT at a certain point in time, where we looked at what's called the billable coding effort. This is a proprietary metric from a measurement tool that you can buy off the shelf. And essentially what this looks at is the lines of code created by a person and the lines of code deleted by a person, and compiles that into a single metric that can be potentially interpreted as a productivity, right? The higher that number, the better the person is. What we found out is that this, early on, there was about a 13% increase in that number over the normal increase compared to control groups. So that was a proper side-by-side empirical experiment, control group, user group, and benchmarked against historical data. And when that number came out, people said, that's great. That's a 30% productivity increase. Now we can start thinking about how we use that bandwidth. And obviously, quite rapidly, people start thinking about, well, does that mean we can do with less people? And as it turned out in the discussions that happened over the months afterwards, is that is not really how you can interpret those numbers, because practically what happens is, well, the only thing you know for sure is that more code is getting generated, but does that actually add more value? Are more features getting completed? But also something that we only realized a little bit later on is that if you have this kind of increase, then likely our competitors will have done a very similar thing. And in that case, even if we push more software through, we're not always going to see the benefit in terms of more turnover or better customer retention, because our competitors have also leveled up. So it was kind of a defensive thing more than anything else. But as I think a rather unique safety aspect of AI that we're thinking about is that AI will change numbers in your organization, right? These charts get plotted all the time these days, and these numbers go up. And then people say, so therefore we can conclude X and take action Y. What I think is a really interesting research challenge in this space is, well, what actually is the business process you're linking this against? What is the impact that you're trying to establish, and are the metrics you're using actually helpful? And you have two kinds of metrics: what you can measure in the business and what you can measure about your AI tool. And I'll get back to that in a little bit, but those things need to be combined to work out what has AI actually done to our organization. Is this moving in the right direction? Yes or no? So likely what you would want to do, and that's one of the things that we thought actually was useful to do, is look at a very specific aspect of AI. I already mentioned these things can do security scans and code reviews. And what you can see here is that this pink line goes up very rapidly, right? The number of security scans on our code rocketed because AI could do it automatically, as opposed to once in a pipeline by something like Cubase or Black Duck or anything like that. That in itself was good, but you get to very interesting different questions in that case, because here what we saw was a false sense of security. People thought, oh, look at all the security scans, our code must be great. Yes, but how do you quantify how accurate an AI is at assessing the security? Right? AI famously is not 100% reliable because it is a statistical predictor more than anything else. It doesn't really understand the security analysis that it is performing. So how reliable is that? And when it does a code review, does that mean that our developers don't have to do the code review? If anything, an interesting question is, if this stuff generates a whole lot of code, are we just not landing up with more code reviews at the end of it, even if AI can code review itself? And should we allow it to mark its own homework? Right? Those are all organizational questions that directly feed into the quality of the software we put out. And because that software contains our customer data and our customer support and our business, those are all very directly safety concerns that emerge from applying AI into a space. Now, a couple of numbers I wanted to show you, because I pulled these numbers yesterday just to show you in hard numbers what the impact is that AI has in this space. At this point in time, already mentioned, we have roughly 3,000 developers using QDeveloper every single day. What we have roundabout per year is 1.5 million additional security scans on various different languages, which is never a bad thing, but again, subject to some stuff. And if you would have to classify it, I would say about 26% of all our code is written at this point in time by AI tooling, which practically means since rollout, we've generated 4.5 million lines of code. Now, those all seem like really good numbers, but there's a perspective I would like to give you here, because when I first saw these numbers materialize, initially I thought this is great, and a couple of seconds later, they absolutely terrified me. And the reason is the following. Pre-AI, 2 years ago, the average number of lines of code generated in BT was 2 million by all our developers, subcontractors, all that kind of stuff. So since then, we've gone to a place where we have 4.5 million lines of code generated by AI, and we're on a trajectory of generating 4 million lines per year from this point forward. That means year on year, the output in terms of lines of code has been doubled, and we have less developers now than we have 2 years ago. So the system has shrunk down, and the throughput is twice as high. And how are we going to deal with that? Right? This in itself is likely my biggest safety/security concern, is the stress that's being put on the system that needs to keep it sane and all the quality in place. That stress has gone up because we have to deal with twice as much work, and we don't necessarily know whether AI can help us deal with that. So these numbers, they look great on a slide, but practically when you think about it, there's a lot of challenges, a lot of research challenges. And this goes back to the point that was made in the intro, is that we as a company are quite happy to share the challenges that we have and share the data we have, because it is PhD research that can really help us find out, so practically what is going on here, right? Whether that is from a technical perspective or from a business perspective. How do you answer these kind of questions when they're happening in real time? And as I said, we have many of these kind of questions. What's also interesting, and this is in part more of a technical research challenge, but this again has its own implications, is a bit of insight into where does AI work well and where doesn't it work well. So what we found, and perhaps unsurprisingly, what AI is really good at in the software space is basic scaffolding, often repeated tasks, things like base UI code, a button that you have to click and an event triggers that then invokes a function, stuff like that. That happens in every single code base. And intuitively, that makes sense because in the training data, these things will be the most present because everyone does this kind of stuff. It's also pretty decent at requirements processing, basic requirement processing, right? You can give it a natural language description and say, can you derive some user stories or some Jira tickets or things like that? It is pretty decent at that. And that's also already fed into the process in BT. But when you further go up this particular axis, what you see is the more specialist you ask, the worse AI gets at it. So if there's any specific business logic, something that is very specific to BT, the AI has the large language model at least likely will not have seen that because it's not in the training data. And if it was, then I would be concerned as to why it was there to begin with. So business logic, it starts to fall off a little bit. When you ask it comprehensive questions that require an understanding of the software system, right? How do these things fit together? Which parts do I have to upgrade to make sure that this and this and this new thing works? Right? It's getting better in that space, but it is still not completely there. When you ask it to understand the requirements rather than just transcribe them, right? Do I have a comprehensive set of requirements here? Is there any contradiction in these requirements? That kind of stuff. That is also not necessarily there yet. That's where the software engineers still have to earn their crust. And I would say at the top level, where it really doesn't help you yet is a comprehensive understanding of the system that's being built and the actual quality. Right? If I give it a software system and say, can you please make this a bit faster? The AI is not going to help you with that. It might give you some suggestions on what you can try, but it's not going to say, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Change this, change that. That's your bottleneck, and that's where you need to go. And it's good to understand this because this is a key aspect of applying AI to any kind of process, right? These are the weaknesses where the system will always give you an answer, but that's where your answers are the most dangerous. So if you build an AI-enabled software system, you have to be aware of at what point will it more likely start hallucinating. Right? The biggest problem with AI in my mind is that it doesn't want to tell you that it doesn't know. It would be so great if it says, just don't have the data for it. So why is that the case? And I've already hinted at that. It's all about what it has seen in the training data and what actually can be captured in training data. Source code, sorting algorithms, sure, we'll have seen 100,000 of those, absolutely no problem. So if you have your large language model that was trained up on that data, and then you ask it, so how do I sort an array? Say, oh yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, that's that. Okay, but what if I'm asking something that it hasn't seen? Then the training data just won't help, and then the system will hallucinate, as mentioned. And that is one of the bigger risks that come with building an AI system or depending on an AI system. And that awareness is as to what when it starts hallucinating is a really interesting one. We kind of have this theory in my team that I think at this point in time it's less of a problem because we are roughly at about 60% accuracy in the software space. So people kind of distrust the answer automatically. It might become more of an issue if it's 99% accurate, because in that case, most times it will give you the right answer, and by the time the wrong answer comes along, you've kind of lost focus on looking for the wrong answer. So there might be some weird thing happening there in the future, but for the moment, you kind of have to accept that most answers need to be checked, and that puts its own stress on using this kind of stuff. Okay, so practically then, when we roll this out, what did our developers think? What was the kind of impact that came out? So unsurprisingly, they were very happy that it was helpful in reducing boring tasks, right? If you don't have to do a boring task, that's great. And it also managed to keep them in the IDE as opposed to going to a website and looking up how something works. Most developers are, I guess, a bit like me. That if I go into a browser and I'm looking for something, I might as well have a look at the news. I get a bit sidetracked and then I get back. That is not necessarily helpful. The most interesting thing that happened is a lot of our developers started to rethink the way they worked, rethink about their processes and all that kind of stuff, just to make their life easier and better. Downsides already mentioned. The suggestions are not always relevant, and it can be hard to get the right answer. And some people just outright said it's not relevant for my work. This is getting better. The technology stack's not being supported, but this is still an issue, particularly for BT specific stuff. And I think what is an interesting angle to AI in the rollout is that it actually created a lot of nerves in the organization, right? The question I got 100 times over is, will AI come for my job? And initially I was trying to settle people's minds, but in due time, I just started to be a bit more honest and said, well, if you ask me, will AI take my job? Then I say yes, but the job as you know it, right? Your job will change. If you only want to do the job you're currently doing now, then likely you're going to lose out. But if you use this golden window that you're in now, where AI is there and the expectations are not completely there yet, this is your time to learn, reshape your job, and then take it forward, and then you will be in a good position. But it's a big ask for people to understand that themselves, right? There's that bigger question of what does that mean? And a lot of people are concerned that their role will be reduced to becoming the person who marks the homework of the AI, or generally just not believing that it's worth it. I think there's a whole lot to be said for I don't believe the hype of AI, because I think the hype is something extreme where people promise 80, 100, 200% reduction in cost or whatever, whereas practically it is an increment, I would say. It's a big increment this time around. You can see 15 to 20% benefit in some way, shape, or form. With anyone promising more than that, I feel is working the numbers a bit. And this does put people off. And this is part of the risk as well that you have in a company, that there might be people who don't want to engage with this and will still be exposed to it in some way, shape, or form, or actively go against it. And AI is very flexible, which is part of the risk that you have. There were even some people who said, I had no idea AI for software development was a thing, which I thought was interesting as well. I'd like to think we've turned those people around, but it does happen. So a couple of risks then for BT that we saw materialize quite early on, right? So obviously, I've already mentioned, there was a lot more code being pushed through the system. We needed quality control on that. And that starts with, at least from a BT point of view, is thinking very carefully about how you state the responsibilities of the job. And I won't go through all these boxes, but this is the process we expect our developers to go through. And this red box was added to it just to make absolutely clear that you are responsible and accountable for the code you produce. If you generate it, that means it is your responsibility to test it, to review it. And if you sign it off, it's no longer what the AI did, it is what you did. Right. And there was a lot of training and there was a lot of awareness in that campaign to make sure that people don't absolve responsibility to, well, AI told me to do that. And that in itself can be a very difficult conversation to have, because then people might say, well, if that's the case, I don't want to use AI, right? So that's it's an interesting business process that was playing out there with AI coming in and potentially being seen as something that was disruptive rather than helpful. And there was an angle that has risks of AI usage that occurred very early on. So one of the big responsibilities my team had in the rollout of the first Gen AI solution in BT is to get a firm understanding of what this would mean for our intellectual property. Because whenever you create a machine where you can put a whole bunch of stuff in and you get an answer back, effectively what you're saying is, where is our data going? That is a really hard question. And when you look at, and this applies to any Gen AI solution, by the way, this is not just code, but in the coding space, it kind of materialized very early on. So we know an LLM consists of training data, and that training data, it is not clear where this comes from. You can go to AWS or Microsoft or wherever and say, well, what's your training data? Well, can't tell you that. That's a trade secret. But in a lot of cases, it comes from big software repositories and projects that have their own licenses against it. And that can become problematic in some way, shape, or form. And I'll get to that. But the first IP concern that BT had is, well, if we have developers working on their machines and they want code completion, then what happens is the plugin here takes the code that you're currently looking at, puts that into a prompt and pushes it into the LLM that lives on AWS or Microsoft or whatever. What are they going to do with that? And are they going to use that to retrain their LLM? Because that is problematic. The reason it's problematic is that later on the LLM might then reply to someone else, oh, this bit of BT code, that's exactly what you're looking for, and that's not what we want, right? And that's not even a theoretical, that happens. So Samsung has in the past sued one of the AI providers because one of their models was retrained on their code, and their code ended up in an LG code base. And if you know your tech history, LG and Samsung are not the best of friends. So they were not best pleased about that. So that obviously is not what you want. And it's not just code. This could also be customer data, for example. You don't want that to leak via an LLM because that's a GDPR breach, and that is a company killer in terms of penalties. So we really trained up the legal team on this technical knowledge so that they understood the legal risk and exposure, and then said, okay, in our contract, we stipulate you cannot retrain your LLM on our data because it's a company risk. We can't have that. It's not the only risk, though. The bigger risk we actually found is what we refer to as intellectual property injection. What happens at times is that an LLM can directly quote from its training data because it is the most logical answer. That doesn't need to be a problem. But if that snippet of training data has a particular license against it, like an open source license or anything else, that means we get that license injected into our code base via the back door, and we might not even be aware of it. And all of a sudden, all our code base needs to be made open source because of that snippet of code that we used from the AI. And that was the biggest concern that we had early on, because that literally would mean that we could be sued for intellectual breach property by using someone else's tool. So there's been a lot of back and forth on that. And in those early days, there wasn't really a legal precedent for this kind of stuff. And what most AI companies land on now is what they call indemnities, which practically means is if something like that happens, all the costs will be covered by the AI provider because their tool caused the problem. But it was a concerted effort of BT and a whole bunch of other companies pointing out this problem and saying we need a better solution to deal with this particular risk. And this is one of the cases where the safety concerns of AI usage were identified early on, and through in-depth research and collaboration across various functions, including legal, including technical, we got to a point where companies are happy with the risk exposure as it currently exists. So suppose you've covered all that off, then obviously you have to, in your company, be aware of, well, what's the kind of stuff that people have to be aware of beyond. And within BT, we like our guardrails, so we have quite comprehensive documentation. But what they point out is things that people need to be aware of for a responsible AI use. And that includes being aware of, for example, the accuracy concerns already mentioned, but also over-reliance could be an issue. And bias is a really big one, right? If you, for example, write an algorithm that will assign subsidies based on people's details, you have to be aware of whether your AI model has a potential bias baked in based on its training set. For example, because the training set just contains more data on particular groups in the population, and therefore it is more likely to assign it to that. And that has happened in the past quite a bit. And if you are not aware that's a risk and you just say, oh, the AI told me this is a great algorithm, seems to work, I'm happy with that, that can become really problematic. Especially if you don't have explainability. If at the end of it, you can't explain why you wrote it like that. If we ever get taken to court as a company and they say, why did you write this algorithm? The defense of, well, the AI told me that that was okay is not good enough, right? We have to be able to say, this is the decisions that we took. This is what the AI did in the meantime. And this is why it came to this particular conclusion. And this is the vetting process we put over the top. So AI does, it adds to the responsibilities because it is a powerful tool that needs to be kept in check through a diligent way of working. So that's where the whole safety angle has been a really big point for BT for quite some time. And then we get to where we are today with AI in BT. So you will have heard a lot about agents and agentic AI. I think the term is tremendously overused, but practically what an agent is, it is a bit of software that can get triggered. Either it can self-trigger or it can get triggered by a specific event by the user, and it contains a default prompt and access to data sources. So, and that agent can then take some of the data in the data sources, take that prompt, go to an LLM, solve a particular problem, and there you go. And what we typically do in applying agents in the software development space is we build agents to support particular development tasks, such as business analysts. A business analyst in BT is a person who takes a requirement specification in natural language in some way, shape, or form, analyzes that and creates implementation tasks for the development teams on a Jira board, which is a Kanban board. And AI is quite good at that because in essence it's summarization, right? So what we have here is an example of a business analyst agent. And you can see this is a typical requirement spec that we have in BT with a scoping document that indicates these are the stakeholders. This is how the system should work. You don't have to understand the document itself, that this is typically what it looks like. And what you can do is load this document into the agent. You can say, okay, this is your input document. Can you now generate a bunch of Jira tickets by looking at these and these sections? And these agents can be quite generic. So we can see it hooked up here. And now what's happening now, this document has been taken, added to a prompt that goes off to an LLM. The LLM does all the analysis and it will spit out a whole bunch of candidate Jira tickets. I will fast forward this just a little bit. I think it was over here, not further. There we go. So what you can see here is you get these kind of cards, and each card talks about a particular area, what is in scope, what is out of scope, and what needs to happen. You can edit this a little bit if you want. You can select the ones you want to take forward. And then at the bottom, there's a button that says push this into Jira, and then you have your tickets done. And this is the kind of stuff that that goes beyond your traditional code completion bit, right? This is where AI is making inroads into other areas in the software development space. And this in itself is interesting, again, from this point of view of what's the impact on the people that will use these tools. When you measure the time people spend on analyzing the requirements documents and getting to Jira tickets for the size of documents you saw, that will typically be a day or two, give or take. And this takes around about 3 minutes. So it sounds like a great time save, right? We roll this out and how great is this going to be? But then we found out when we did our early trials that it is actually quite possible for the thing to come up with cards that don't need to be done at all, or stuff that is not properly scoped or assigned to the right actors and stakeholders. So you have a need to still go through all of them with a fine-tooth comb to find out whether you actually want to have them and edit them. And it turns out then those 2 minutes quite happily turn into a day. So you still saved a day, but you didn't save 2 days, right? That's that happens quite a bit. But that doesn't mean it's not worth having. It just means that the realistic outcome of this kind of stuff is going to be subject to research, subject to deeper understanding, especially because this kind of stuff feeds into onwards processes, right? Those cards get picked up by developers. And if you can generate a lot more cards, does that then automatically mean that developers will process a lot more cards, right? Where's your bottleneck, or are you just creating a new bottleneck in this kind of environment? And the biggest security aspect that you have here is that these agents are really powerful, and they are very easy to build. That's also part of the problem. I already mentioned they have a data source and they talk to an LLM. And typically what you would have, and BT has this, is you have a whole bunch of those agents working against the same language model, accessing their own data sources, and it's all fine. And you think, oh, nothing too much of an issue. However, these agents can talk to each other. A key feature is that you decompose and these agents communicate via a particular protocol, which is called MCP. And that's where you get the biggest issue. These agents at this point in time are not properly locked down. There is a security concern at this point in time, where you have agents that can talk to this agent, and this agent can talk to that agent, and this agent can talk to that agent, and this agent access that data source and give all that information back. And this agent should not have access to this data source, right? It's a free for all in this space at this point in time. And for a company like BT, where we have all our open reach concerns and we have all our consumer data and all that kind of stuff, that is a big safety feature, right? Data is the biggest concern in this space. And this is where a big research challenge lies, because on the one side, we want people to create these things and streamline the organization. But on the other side, we want to make sure that all our guardrails are followed and that it's not a free for all. Right. I will start wrapping up because I think I'm overrunning a little bit. This is my last slide anyway, so I hope that's okay. Where is all this going? And I think I've kind of sketched out what you can see here is that we have a whole bunch of roles in BT, right? We have our software developers and we have our data scientists and we have our project managers and our graphical designers and our auditors and all that kind of stuff. And people will build AI-enabled software systems and using AI, and there will be an AI assistant for the software developers, for the project managers, the graphical designers, etc. But the main thing that I think will start happening in the future is all these tools will have to work from a single source of truth, right? The software developers and the data scientists and the project managers all have to work from this single source of truth, where all the history of what has happened up to now in the development project is stored, captured, and can be reasoned with. The move is into this space. And I think this is as a framing device of this is likely where the AI software development vision is going. When you think of your particular PhDs and which particular safety angles come into play here, I've given you a few in this talk, but there are many more. This is kind of where the world is heading at this point in time, at pace. And the good thing for you is that the safety question is a hard question. So nobody will solve that over the next 2 weeks. But if you're looking for endless examples of our concerns in this space, please have a chat with me because I'm very happy to see how we can work together on this kind of stuff. I hope this gives you a bit of an idea of AI in the real world and how this is working or not working in companies. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Joost, thank you so much for that presentation. It's been really interesting to hear from you about the opportunities and the risks that you see within BT, especially around the LLMs. For me, I think it's particularly interesting that even in a really technologically heavy and technologically focused company, you're still seeing that interface and having to deal with some of the socio-technical questions as well. And that I think that's fascinating. So we've got time for a few questions from our group. I'll prioritise our postgraduates first, and then I've got a couple which I'm dying to ask, but I'll hold those back for now. Tom, why don't we start with you?
Hi, yes, thank you very much for that. I'm just going to take a second since I'm kind of the first in the room just to see if you can hear us all right, but I assume the room's reasonably well mic'd up. That's looking good.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Brilliant. So thank you for that. You touched on some really interesting safety questions in particular, and I think the one that was particularly of interest to me was around dealing with that quantity of code being generated by AI compared to like the general quantity of code that was being generated in the past. You showed some really interesting metrics around that throughput, and a lot of that's kind of very quantitative in terms of, well, yeah, we're getting loads more code generated, and you touched on why that might not be an ideal metric. I wonder if you've explored any metrics around kind of quality of code in terms of like maybe some kind of A/B testing between like, well, this is code generated by just people, this is code that was supported by AI generation, and maybe, for example, how much of that code passed a code review on the first attempt, that sort of thing.
Well, it's a really good question. So we have done quite in-depth analysis in all kinds of metrics where we could find them. And the good thing about BT is that BT loves quantifying stuff in general. So we had tools like SonarQube and Black Duck and things like that running in BT to keep an eye on our code quality. And they typically look at things like readability or testability or test coverage and all those kind of metrics. So because we know exactly at what point we introduced AI and we know who started using it, we did this kind of before and after comparison. So we have these trend lines that indicate, okay, this was the quality metric for this pre-AI and post-AI. And what you could see, interestingly, is initially there was a bit of a wobble, right? There were people who weren't exactly sure. They were kind of experimenting it a little bit. I think they were a bit more open-minded about, okay, let's just see how good this is. But after the wobble, it kind of stabilized round about where it was before. The code quality did not seem to be too much affected, except for the areas where the introduction of AI led to an expectation of fast delivery. Because at that point, the quality control is the one that suffered, and that's where we saw spikes to the negative. And the initial thought was, well, AI will help us out. But if you purely look at it's a good question. That, in my mind, there's not really such a thing as purely AI generated code, because the process typically works. A developer has a small problem, AI helps out, and then the developer finalizes that. So it's kind of this hybrid thing that comes out. So you have AI assisted code and just pure developer created code. So I would argue there hasn't been too much of a negative impact in terms of code quality that I have seen, except for when you are using AI to whip people into being more productive, and you push that seems at that point you kind of defer to AI, I guess.
Thanks, that's great. I'm going to open up to other questions, please, Austin.
So recently I saw a study by MIT which suggested that something on the order of 95% of company-wide AI initiatives were unsuccessful. And I saw a response to that study which suggested this might be because when the company tries to have their employees use these AI tools, instead they prefer to use AI tools by external companies. So I'm wondering, when you're measuring these impacts of this Q developer tool, are you concerned that maybe it's hard to isolate the impact of this tool from other tools that the software that developers might be using without having been instructed to do so by the PT?
So it is a really good question. So specifically about the software tooling, it is something that BT quite actively chases after, right? Because people always have preferences, right? When we introduced Q Developer with a good reasoning behind it, people said, "Oh, I prefer GitHub Copilot" or something like that. The fact of the matter is that if there is no corporate contract that that describes what will happen to the data we put in, and what happens if they give us malicious data out, if there is no corporate contract to that, then that means nobody is going to cover that, right? So if people are using GitHub Copilot on their own personal account in BT, that is considered breach of contract because that endangers the company. And that's a position that we took fairly early on, where we said, well, look, we're very happy to listen to you about whether you like the tool or not. And if you have a good case, we'll get the tool for you. But if you use a tool on your own personal account and we find out, then it's that's the end of the line, because in that case, I'm not kidding, that potentially could kill the company, right? If we leak personal data, then we get GDPR fine, and that's typically expressed in percentages of turnover. So that's a fine that BT cannot afford. And I'm sure under the hood at times, sometimes it still happens, but BT is quite proactive in trying to capture that. But that is very specific about a personal preference for tool. I think what you're talking about as well is a different thing, where if BT develops some kind of solution internally that is just not up to scratch, and there's something else that actually does the trick better, then BT has been very open about having discussions on, okay, look, we need solutions that work very well, and we want to cut through the hype. So we build our own internal solutions primarily to work out what it is that we want. And if we find a competitive offering, then we will buy that as long as we can understand what the impact is. But we will not necessarily hang on to our own internal solution if it is not up to scratch or it's not what people want. Because BT is quite aware that we are not an AI tool development business, right? We're a telco, so we focus on that core business. And I think the MIT study, in a way, did not completely do justice to that particular angle, that a lot of AI initiatives fail because companies are in the exploration phase, right? We are trying to work out, where do we want to go? How do we reshape a company? So the failing is part of the learning, I think, in that case. And I would expect the number of successful applications to go up in due time with the progressing insight that we get from that.
Thanks, yes. I think we've got time for one more question. Fiona, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any instances where your Q developer tool was down or not working for any reason, and like how did people react to that? And do you see that as a problem going forwards if it's used more?
It's a good question. Yes, we have had that. It's an interesting one. So what happened a while ago is Amazon introduced a new development environment, and a lot of people were really interested in test driving that across the world. And that overwhelmed the LLM backend. And what happened on our side is our Q developer at that point said, sorry, service not available. And we had a lot of developers instantly into our team chat saying, oh, look, this thing is not working. I really need it to work now. Obviously, that's not great if that happens. And then you have a chat with the vendor and you say, look, how are you going to maintain a service? Because that's all part of our contracts, right? If they don't provide us the service they promised, then there are going to be some stern discussions at a pay grade way beyond me. I personally found that quite a good sign in a way, because definitely early on, that was a suggestion to me, is that people kind of see this as a commodity tool that I need versus a novelty that I'm entertaining because my line manager told me so. If this keeps happening, then it becomes problematic, but I would say that is of a similar problem of any service you consume. Right? If your authentication service goes down or your database provider goes down, that's problematic as well, and that will be hardwired into contracts. BT as a company is big enough, luckily, to do that. But yeah, that's it is yet another dependency on software as a service, and that needs to be managed carefully. I would agree. The bigger concern that you can see happening at this point in time is the people are using this stuff more and more and exploring the boundaries of it. And what happens quite rapidly is that you run out of token limits. So there's a typical and upper limit to how many interactions you can have with AI per month. And if people run into the limit because they were a bit enthusiastic with their experimentation, that means they have half a month where they don't have the tool they need for their productive work. And this is an internal business management kind of thing. Is how many tokens do we pay for, and how do we make sure people use those tokens wisely? And that's an educational aspect of AI in the company.
Thank you. I'm going to draw it to a close now because we've got our next phase of the morning. But Joost, thank you so much for being so open about all the different aspects of what you've talked to us about. I don't know if you can quite see us, but there were 26 of us in the room and there were lots of nodding heads as you were giving us some answers. So clearly lots to think about from what you've said to us. So we really appreciate that you've taken the time and we look forward to seeing you in person at some point in the future as well. So please join me in thanking Joost just one more time.